Hi there, and welcome to this video on the Explaining History YouTube video channel. And this is going to be all about the Long March of the Chinese Communist Party from 1934 to October 1935. Now, this is a story of extraordinary proportions. The distance that was marched was the estimates are anywhere between 3,000 to 8,000 miles. 100,000 Chinese communists start the march, but less than 5,000 to 8,000 end it. Most of them die along the way. And the epic nature of the Long March and the amount of sacrifice on what we would call martyrdom meant that the Long March went on to become one of the founding legends of the Communist Party. And it made the ordinary peasant people of China think of communists as determined, as proud, as able to withstand any kind of punishment, people of immense endurance, and an incredibly patriotic movement. The reason why many Chinese peasants came to see it like this is because the Chinese communist leader who emerged as a result of the Long March, Mao Zedong, was very skilled at propaganda. Propaganda is the use of media and films and radio and books and plays and to change public perceptions of the communists. Now let's talk a little bit about the Communist Party. The Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, was founded in 1921. And it was founded in 1921, 10 years after China itself had undergone a revolution to overthrow the Qing dynasty and to become a republic. Now, the revolutionaries who had overthrown the Qing dynasty weren't communists, they were nationalists, and communism was a very minor idea in China at that point. Communism was an idea that had taken hold in Russia. It had become the state in Russia in October 1917, and Russian diplomats and agents had made some inroads into China in the early 1920s. They had been keen to export the revolution into Asia and into Europe. It was difficult for the Russian Bolshevik revolutionaries to transfer communist ideas into Europe. After 1919, there's a brief period in 1919 in Europe where it looks likely that a revolution might take hold in Germany and in Hungary, and thereafter both those fail, and thereafter there's no chance of exporting communist ideas into Europe. So the leader of the Russian new Soviet state, Vladimir Lenin, expresses some interest in attempting to export communist ideas into China. So in 1921, a small communist party emerges. One of its early members was Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, the son of a Chinese peasant, had witnessed the 1911 revolution in the countryside. And what he had witnessed was bloody violence against Chinese landowners, Chinese nobles, again by the peasants. And he knew that China was mainly made up of peasants, and so there was an immense amount of power in the peasants, and anyone who could harness the violence of the peasants and the pent-up angers and frustrations of the peasants would become extremely powerful. They could direct this like a weapon against any part of Chinese society, and this is what Mao later on attempts to do after 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party comes to power. Now, after the 1911 revolution, China very quickly divides into a north and a south. A northern government, a government essentially of warlords, is headed by a general, Yuan Shikai, who proclaims himself emperor and who dies in 1916. The southern government, the government of the revolutionary organization, the Tongmenhui, later renamed the Kuomintang, or the Kuomintang, runs from Guangzhou in Canton province, and the southern government, led by Sun Yat-sen until his death in 1924, sought to unify all of China to create one unified Chinese republic. However, almost completely the opposite thing happens in the 1920s, and China fragments into a series of feuding warlord states. After the death of Yuan Shikai, the Chinese warlords compete with one another for power. And into this division, the Japanese begin to take the advantage. Japan had been granted in 1919, after the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles, Japan had been granted concessions along China's coast, particularly on the Shandong Peninsula. The Shandong Peninsula was near Beijing, and it was the birthplace of Chinese Buddhism and Confucianism. And this was, seems a terrible affront to the Chinese. And also, if you controlled Shandong, you controlled much of northern China. It was where most of the railway network met, and it was very close to Beijing, so you could put the capital under immediate threat. Eventually, the Japanese withdrew from Shandong, but it was a way of showing Japan's interests in China. The Japanese believed that Japan was a small island, that it was a country of limited resources, and therefore it was a country that needed to be able to expand, that the Japanese were a growing people. There were some 80 million Japanese by the 1930s, and Japan itself lacks any mineral resources. They don't have much in the way of iron and steel. And also, they don't have much in the way of, well, they don't have any oil. And it was believed by the Japanese government that Japan would start to run out of food at some point in the 20th century. And therefore, colonizing into mainland China was, in their view, the most sensible option. This was something when they looked at how Europeans had colonized North America, they seemed to, with I suppose some justification, believe that this was an inevitable part of the growth of warlike and technologically advanced peoples. This is kind of how history went, and it's an idea that Hitler also shared about the role of the fate of the German people to rule over the Slavs of Eastern Europe. So by the late 1920s, early 1930s, Japan has a considerable presence, and Japan in fact invades Manchuria in 1932, and then the rest of mainland China in 1937. So this is the kind of the background, the context to the Long March. As the Chinese Communist Party grew throughout the 1920s, the new leader of the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, who comes to lead the party in 1926. He, on this period of time in 1926, leads a campaign against the warlords in the north called the Northern Expedition. He takes armies from the south, from the strongholds in Guangzhou, in Canton province, and marches north and manages successfully to rout the northern warlords and begin to reunify China. But as he did this, Chiang Kai-shek realised that there was a greater problem, and he was immensely suspicious of the growing strength and popularity of the Communist Party. Chiang viewed it as his role to be the teacher of China. He referred to the process that China must undergo as a tutelage, that China must be educated in modern ideas such as nationalism, and that Chinese people must be encouraged to think of themselves as citizens of a new Chinese republic, not simply peasants and the feudal property of the emperor. He encouraged them to think in broadly liberal terms, that there was a state which guaranteed them certain rights, but also in anti-communist terms, and also in slightly anti-capitalist terms as well. Chiang didn't want China to end up like Soviet Russia, but he also didn't want China to end up like America either in the 1920s, which he thought was full of cutthroat businessmen and gangsters, and he didn't want the kind of American commercial values to be able to run riot through traditional Chinese peasant life. In 1927, Chiang turned on the communists. Up until this point, the communists had had a reasonably good relationship with the Kuomintang. The communists, as I said, are a very small party. By the end of the 1920s, the Kuomintang have a membership of about 50,000, whereas the communists have a membership of about a tenth of that. The communists have a good relationship with the left wing of the Kuomintang, and Chiang Kai-shek became increasingly suspicious of the communists, partly because they were linked to the Soviet Union, and Chiang Kai-shek argued that this meant that they had divided loyalties and that the Soviet Union was able to meddle in Chinese affairs. And on April the 12th, 1927, Chiang Kai-shek finally acted and purged, arrested and executed thousands of communists, really destroying the heart of the Chinese Communist Party for some time. The communists respond by essentially declaring war on the Kuomintang, and an uprising begins. A small guerrilla army, which later becomes the Chinese People's Liberation Army, forms itself and is largely unsuccessful in its attacks on the Kuomintang. They attempt to seize cities in the south, such as Guangzhou, and they're joined by some of Chiang Kai-shek's own soldiers who've crossed over from the other side. And they manage eventually, by 1928, to seize some of the cities in southern China. And between 1928 and 1933, there are 5 attempts to destroy the communists as a military force, 5 encirclement campaigns. And it's these campaigns that lead to the exodus of the Chinese communists on the Long March. There seems to be, in the minds of the communists, very little alternative but to try to flee to Jiangxi, where hopefully they'll be safe, and the communist forces can regroup and finally take the fight to Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists. Throughout this whole process, Mao Zedong is a relative unknown, and it's the Long March from 1933 to 34 where he becomes a significant and important figure in Chinese communism. Okay, so that's everything from me for the moment. If you found this useful, if it's going to help in your exams, please remember subscribe to this YouTube channel, because there'll be more videos like this on the way. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.